I received this model of Davy Jones from Pirates of the Caribbean as part of the CA3D Studios Patreon I subscribe to each month. The sculpt is by Sergio Kazov and Leandro Cruz, and this video is not sponsored by CA3D Studios or anybody, but I do want to give them a shout out for releasing 8 or 9 really great detailed models every single month for an absolute steal of a price. After the printing's done, I clean up all my models by sanding support marks, and then I always dry fit them to ensure everything fits well together with minimal seams. The last thing you want is to have to fill the gaps after you've painted 2 pieces that need to go together. Here I'm using a Vallejo Game Color Express Caribbean turquoise color to tint the clear resin base, or the translucent resin base. You'll see some seam marks here that I filled with transparent UV resin. Those seams don't much matter because they're going to get covered up by the base of the ship that's coming in after anyway. Something I really like about these express colors, same thing I like about the Citadel contrast colors, is that they are almost like an ink in that they're quite transparent for the most part. But they have really nice vibrant colors. So this one's got a really nice blue-green color to it. I found this piece and a couple of the other really large pieces very difficult to work with because there was not much to hold on to, and they were kind of almost too big for my little spray booth. So then I came in afterwards with a Vallejo model color dark sea blue, and that's to get all the darkest parts, the shadows of the base here. So I went around the bottom of it and then sprayed it up into the shadows a bit, and then I went in with a Liquitex heavy gloss and an off-white Vallejo color here, and this is to create like I think what's called the crest of the waves, where it's a bit of that sea foam white splashing effect. So I took some of that out and stuck it into a cup, mixed in some off-white paint, and stirred it all up here. Something that I found quite useful are these dollar store sponges for applying kind of a random stippled texture. And you can first go in with a paintbrush like I did here and apply a bit of the white paint there. And then later on I'm going to come in with that sponge piece and sort of dab it around so you don't see any of the brush strokes or smooth stroke marks that are left over. I feel like I probably went a little bit overboard with the white there, but once you're done with that, you can go in and just spray the whole thing with a gloss clear coat, which will bring kind of a wet look to those waves. Next, we're going to talk about filling gaps. So I use this Milliput, this yellow gray standard Milliput. It's like an epoxy putty. You can use all kinds of things to fill gaps, but I found this to be the best. And then I use these cheap and useful sculpting tools that I got from the dollar store, and stir stick of some kind, and a little plastic dish. I reuse these when I get takeout food. So how the Milliput works, you take equal parts of that and mix it together until it's a uniform color. And then you just roll it up like a little snake and stick it in the gaps there. And you can use anything to push it into the gaps. You can use your fingers. I use a mix of little paint brushes and these silicone sculpting tools. And then you can add a little bit of isopropyl alcohol to whatever you're moving it around with. And it kind of softens it up a little more and helps it blend a bit with the hard surface. And so if you've got something that's textured, you can really try to mimic that texture. So in this case, where the gap is crossing some wooden planks, I'm trying to mimic what those wooden planks look like through the gap. So it will help hide any excess putty there. And then you can also use this UV clear resin. I got that off of Amazon, and it sets with a little UV flashlight there. I have no idea what NM stands for, but that's what it is if you're looking for one. And I take a little bit of that and I stick it in the gaps that I can't get Milliput into, and then I use that UV flashlight to cure that. When you've got a surface where there's texture, and it's very fine texture, it's very difficult to mimic, you want to try to hide that seam as best as you possibly can. So what I did was I took a bit of bandage from a first aid kit, and I stuffed the Milliput into here first and smoothed it all out the best I could, using the sculpting tools and a Q-tip there. And then after it was in there, I took that bandage and I pushed it into the Milliput to transfer that pattern into the Milliput. So when it dries, it kind of matches the texture of the coat. Next, we're going to move into Zenithal highlighting here, and all the pieces are going to get a Zenithal highlight. And so what I do with that is I just take the primed pieces. They've all been primed with Vallejo black primer, surface primer, and I use a white ink. And when you're doing Zenithal highlighting, you want to pick where your light source is coming from, and then you want to apply white paint like it's coming down from those light sources. Anywhere where there's going to be natural shadows, you want to leave those dark. So when you come in with your colors later, you get some nice contrast colors and a good transition between your lights and your darks. If you've got a smaller model, it's much easier to have it all kind of dry fit together, and then do all this at the same time. But because all these pieces were quite large, I had to do them in individual pieces. So you just have to remember where your light source is coming from. So it's easier to dry fit it there when it's all done, and make sure that the light source is consistent amongst all the pieces there. Now onto the paint colors. I'm laying down a base of English uniform brown over the entire ship base here. You don't have to worry too much about getting all of the recesses and stuff like that, but you want to get a pretty even coat across the entire piece here. Once that's done, I'm going to come in with a Cygor brown, which is a darker brown. You could use any real dark brown, and I hit all the shadows with that Cygor brown. Like all contrast paints, I don't thin these ones at all. I put them right through the airbrush. Then for my highlights, I come in with a desert tan of Vallejo watercolor. Any light sand or light flesh tone even might have worked for this. I prefer the sand or the khaki colors for brown highlight areas. I did miss a little bit of footage here. I just painted all the bone, the skeleton here. I used a Vallejo game color off-white, which didn't have very good coverage, so I had to come back in later and used a Pro Acryl ivory to cover up those bone areas again. Whenever I do bone or fingernails or anything like that, I always cover those ivory or off-white colors with a coat of Citadel Contrast Skeleton Horde. It just brings it a little more realism to the bone colors. In the areas where there would be natural shadows there, I did go a bit darker and came in with a second coat of that Skeleton Horde. So up underneath sort of the top of the ribs where it would be shadowed out by the hull of the ship there. Next, I used some Reichland Flesh Shade to create some imperfections in the bone. So if you ever look at aged bone, pictures of bones, you see they're not just a flat off-white. They always have some imperfections to them, little specks or marks. And so by turning down the pressure on the airbrush, you see me testing it on my glove there. When you pull the trigger back at such a low air pressure, it just splatters little specks over the surface of the bone. You don't have to worry too much about overspray here because everything around it's so dark. A little overspray, you wouldn't see it. If you didn't have an airbrush, you could also just put a little bit of this paint on a toothbrush or an old paintbrush and sort of flick it at it. That would do the same thing. Next thing we're going to move into is some of the coral on the ship. And for that I used Pro Acryl Bold Pyrrole Red for that main red color, I like to always print off the pictures and sort of match up some of the colors. And then I used an amaranth red of Vallejo watercolor as the highlights of that coral. So you can see me going in here and just painting that bold pyrrole red. It's a really nice color. It's probably the most vibrant red that I've got in all my paint colors. I'd recommend anyone pick that up. It's an excellent addition to your paint collection. I'm just using like a Citadel starter brush there. It's not in very good shape, but I find when I'm just laying down base colors on these larger models, and just any small brush will do. There's no need to use your good brushes for this. Quite often you end up sort of pushing it in the recesses and stuff like that, and you wouldn't want to use your really good brushes for that. I use cheap synthetic brushes for most of my bigger work, and I save my Klinsky sable brushes for the finer detail stuff. Once that base color is laid down, I'm going to take that amaranth red, which is more like an orangish red, and I'm going to dry brush it over top of that red to get the highlights and to create a little bit more interest in colors there. Up next are the muscles, and I used a Pro Acro Blue Black as a base color, followed by Vallejo Model Color Cavalry Brown. And then I finish off the muscles with a Vallejo Model Color Off-White. You could use any off-white or ivory color here. And same with the brown, any brown you wanted to use. That's the good part about painting. There's no right or wrong colors. It's just whatever you think looks good and looks appealing to your eye. Sometimes you will find once you put it down, it dries a little darker, a little lighter than you would have liked, and you just come back in and you just paint over it again. As long as you're painting with thin coats, it's never a problem covering those previous colors back up and then doing it all over again. Now, what I'm doing here with the muscles, same with the coral, you'll see repeated many times through this video as those elements show up on different parts of the model here. When you're applying the brown and white colors, you want to do it in a way that seems like random kind of patterns, but also you want to do it in like a sweeping motion, where if you look at a mussel shell, same with a clam shell or anything like that, you'll see those arcs in the shell. So I just try to repeat those patterns to make it look a bit more natural. Once that's all done, I came in with some Citadel shade Agrax Earthshade. I use a lot of Agrax Earthshade for weathering. And this is where you kind of have to trust the process. So I covered the entire thing with Agrax Earthshade. You wouldn't have to do this necessarily. It's basically like a brown wash over the entire thing, and I wanted to get it into all those recessed areas, and it gets in between the cracks and the boards there and gives it a bit more of a realistic look. When you're doing this, you might start thinking to yourself, oh, I'm messing it up, but it's fine. It does cover up some of the highlights that you've done previously, but we'll just come back in here when we're done and re-add those highlights back in with a bit of dry brush, and you'll see. Although you don't have to be too careful here, you do want to be a little bit careful, especially around some of the finer stuff. So you can see, like where the rope is up over the parts of the ship there. You just want to be careful not to get too much of that shade or the wash that you're using too close to the smaller areas, because where it's so liquidy, it can flow right into those areas. And then you'll have to touch up those after you're done. If If you don't have Agrax or Shade, you can use other things. You can even make your own brown wash or black wash for this. You can just take some brown paint or black paint and you can water it down really heavily and then use that in a similar way as I'm using the Earth Shade here. So here's when we come back in and we're going to re-add all of the highlights that we had in previously that the Agrax Earth Shade covered up. So I just took a bit of dry brush. I used a desert tan here. You could use any kind of off-white or light yellow brown color. Like Dak Tan would have worked out really well as well. I use a lot of Dak Tan in my paintings. Next, I want to add some more realistic effects to it. So I use this Dirty Down Moss, which is a really excellent product. It creates a really nice moss and algae effect. So what I do is I just mix a little bit of water in with it. And I always use an old brush because I expect this wouldn't be very good for expensive brush hairs. And I just start putting it wherever I think moss might be growing. So you can see I'm adding it to the greenery hanging off the ship there and into the eye sockets and up and around sort of random places. You don't want to make it look like you're creating a pattern or anything, but anywhere where it looks like water might settle on the ship or in the recessed areas or places where it wouldn't drain very well, and then just random spots on the bone in the ship there. And you can wipe it off with a damp towel. If it gets on a bit too heavy, you just add a little bit of water to a brush and you can take some of that off. Looking at the boot now, I'm picking up my colors here. So I go brown, which will be for the shadows. I'm going to use a saddle brown for the base coat. And then for the highlight areas, I'm going to come in with a Vallejo model color red leather, which is really nice for boots and anything leather related. And then there's some spots where I'm going to put a Rhinox hide color, and that's just to add a little more interest, so it's not all the same color browns. So where I already had the base of Saigor brown on there, I'm just coming in and just covering all that again with a saddle brown. And then up from underneath, spraying into the shadows and darker areas that Saigor brown, and up around where the boot meets the sole there. And then I'm going to dry brush the whole thing with that Vallejo red leather, or any light brown would have done the trick here. On the back of the boot, there's a leather patch that looks like it might be a different color leather, so I'm just adding a Rhinox hide. You could use any darker brown or lighter brown, just to add a little bit of visual interest to the boot. And then I'm going to come in with that same Rhinox hide, and I'm going to the laces of the boot here with a smaller brush. And I'm just careful here not to get any extra paint outside the laces, because if you make a mistake here, it's a little bit harder to correct where you've got all that blending done beforehand between the browns. Nice transitions, you don't want to mess them up. Once that's done, I came in with Vallejo model color black, which is my favorite black to use. It covers very well, dries very nice, and I just did the sole of the shoe with that black color, although I left underneath mostly just covered in a dark brown, but since you'll be standing on top of something, you're never going to see that anyway. Moving on to his undersuit here, we're going to use a Vallejo Game Color Somber Gray as the base gray for that. You'll see me just doing each of the three parts here where that's applicable. Once those base colors are done, I moved on to the shadows and recesses, and I used a Vallejo Model Color Model Air forest green color for this. I wanted to make it look like a really dingy and dirty old gray fabric, so I thought that might give it a bit of a kind of an algae look, I guess, in the shadows. Once that was all done, I came back and did the highlights with a Vallejo Model Color neutral gray. Any lighter gray than your base color gray would have worked here. This just happened to be what I had on hand. Once that was done, I noticed it didn't have quite as much contrast between the layers as I would have liked, and so I added a dry brush of Vallejo Model Color Deck Tan to all over the fabric here, and because the model was textured, it left the gray in all of the darker areas, and just really brought that texture out quite a bit by using the dry brush technique here. Still not entirely happy with how the lights came out. I went back in with a bit more of an aggressive dry brush of that deck tan and really pushed it into that texture there. Once that was done, I used a Vallejo Weathering Effects Streak and Grime, and I just put that into the tears of the fabric to create a bit of an algae effect. Then I came in with a Citadel Contrast Athematic Blue and started doing some of the sea life attached to his pants there. I had to do a couple coats of this, and then later on when I did similar spots on the other parts of the models, I ended up using a base lighter blue, blue pastel blue. So I didn't have to put quite so many layers here. It worked out in the end. I think I had to put about 3 layers of that down. Next I'm going to move to the pastel pink, which I used as a base coat here. And there's 3 types of, I guess, coral. I'm not a sea life expert, but that's what I'm calling them. That one I did with the Athematic Blue. And then this next one, which isn't red, it's going to be kind of like a pinkish purple. And I used that AK pastel pink as the base color for all of those little pieces there. Up next is a Citadel Contrast Volupus pink color, and I'm putting that over top of that pastel pink, and you can tell, like a lot of contrast colors, it's a very vibrant pinkish purple color, because a lot of this model is sort of a dark and grimy type colors. I really wanted to add some really bright pops of color into these coral areas. A lot of the times you can substitute paint colors for other paint colors, but I find when you're looking for something that flows into the recesses really nice and has a really nice color, either the Vallejo Game Color Express colors or the Citadel Contrast paints, whatever you want to use, there really isn't another paint color that you can substitute those with. Certainly nothing from the main lines there. Next, I'm moving into the bright pale green. It's a Pro Aqua color. It's a really nice kind of mint green. And I dry brush that over top of that Athematic blue. And then I start working on the muscles on the legs here. And same process as the ship, I use that Pro Aqua blue black color. And then once that's done, I'm going to move over to the cavalry brown color and then the off-white color over top of that. This was probably my least favorite piece of the whole model to paint, although it's got a lot of fine detail and I really enjoyed adding the colors to it. I just found it was kind of the piece I was most looking forward to getting out of the way. A lot of the smaller pieces were very close together, and because my hands shake because I am old and decrepit, I found it very difficult not to accidentally get a little bit of paint on a piece I didn't intend in this area. And then I had to come back in and clean it up. Moving on to the bold pyrrole red again. I'm just painting all of that bright coral on his pants here. Same process as before. Once that's done, I come back with that amaranth red again, and I just dry brush that over top of the pyrrole red on the highlights. Once that's done, I've got to paint the barnacles, so I start with a base of ivory. You could use any off-white color here, and I just go in with a small brush, and I'm just covering all the barnacles with that off-white or ivory color. I'm not sure if all ivory colors have good coverage, but I found that the Proacryl ivory had pretty great coverage for a light color. Although I found a lot of the Proacryl paint line to be very similar. It paints on quite smooth. It's easy to thin down, and they're all really, really nice colors. And because barnacles look like bone, I came in and covered all of those areas that I just painted with ivory with a coat of skeleton horde Citadel contrast paint, and that gets up into all the recesses and gives it a really nice contrast. And then for all the just plain rock like areas, I guess, I went in with Drakenhof Nightshade, which is a Citadel shade color. It's like a dark blue. I use that a lot on stone, and I just flooded it all over that whole area with an old brush there. And it gets into all little nooks and crannies, and just gives your eyes something else to look at besides that coat of gray that was on there previously. Next up, I have to move on to the crab leg there. So I give it a base coat of skeleton horde, and then covered most of it with a contrast Griffhound orange, and then gave it a strip of contrast Blood Angels red over it. Moving on to the sword, I used all the same techniques I have done previously, where there's coral and stone. So base coats of that really light pastel pink, and I'll end up coming in here in a bit with that lapis pink over top of that. And then I also used a base coat of light blue before that contrast athematic blue over top of it. And then painting the muscles on the sword there. So again, with that blue-black color for the base, cavalry brown for the next color, and then a bit of off-white or ivory for the final touches there. Once that was done, I started working on the barnacles on the sword, again with a base coat of ivory or any off-white color would do the trick here. And once that base coat is laid down, then I'll be coming back and covering it all with a pretty heavy coat of Citadel contrast skeleton horde to really make those barnacles pop. Got a bit off frame there for a second, but I was just pulling out some of the Drakenhof nightshade, and I'm using that now to cover up all the sort of spots in between the bright color spots where it's mostly just kind of rocky looking. You could most definitely just leave all of that gray if you wanted to. I just like to add some a little bit of blue there because it gives your eye something else to look at. And we'll finish off by using the Pro Acryl Bronze, which is my favorite bronze color to use. And I'm just painting the handles of the sword there where they're poking through all of that coral and rock area there. Moving right along to the belt, I used a base of Vallejo Game Color Scarlet Red and hit all the shadowed areas with a Vallejo Game Color Evil Red, which is almost a purple. And then over the highlights, I used a Scarlet Red. On top of that, red fabric sash, I guess it's called, is a brown leather belt. So I gave it a base of Rhinox hide and then came in with a really heavy dry brush of that red leather color, and that gives you a bit of a weathered leather look where it keeps all the darkness in the cracked areas, but it gives you light highlights. And for the buckle, I used again that Pro Acryl bronze color paint. The problem I have with most metallic paints is that they airbrush really well, but they don't always brush on very smooth. But I have been very impressed with the Pro Acryl metallics that I have tried. They seem to brush on very nice, and they airbrush great as well. After the belt buckle, I did the buttons on the shirt with a metallic lead belcher base paint, and then hit it with a quick highlight of Vallejo aluminum. After that was the lobster claw arm. I gave it a base coat of skeleton horde, and then turned down the pressure on the airbrush and put some black paint in there and speckled it all over the lobster claw there. Once that was done, I gave it a pretty heavy coat of Gryph-hound orange, leaving a few spots around the joints uncovered, and then coated the edges with that Citadel contrast Blood Angels red, similar process as the crab leg on the pants. And then I used the hair dryer just to dry it all up there. After that was done, I started working on all the barnacles. Same process as before, base coat of ivory paint, and then that'll be followed up with the skeleton horde over top of that. And then the muscles here, again, just the same process we used before. Base coat of that Proacryl blue black, and then a bit of Calvary brown, and then that off-white to finish it off. After masking off the shirt with some silly putty, then I went and loaded up the airbrush with dark gray blue for base color for the coat, the overcoat, and then went into all the shadows with a blue black and did all the highlights with a Vallejo model color flat blue. Next I dry brushed stone gray over all the stuff all over his back just to lighten it up a little bit, getting ready for color. After that I came back with some of that pastel blue, after that was done, I got that AK pastel pink and started base coating all of the coral pieces that were going to be that pinky purpley color. After that is the bold pyrrole red. Same process for this as we've done a couple different times now. Just covering up those pieces of coral that I want to be really bright red and give it a good pop of color, where the rest of that jacket is a pretty dull color. And then it was time for the contrast paints, the Aethermatic blue, covering up that pastel blue color. Give it that really vibrant color. And then I used that Vulpus pink over top of the pastel pink color. And I had also dry brushed over top of the Aethermatic blue using that bright pale green color just over the very tops of it, just to give it a bit of a highlight there. Moving on to the muscles on the back of the coat, again using that blue black color as the base, Calvary brown, and then the off-white to finish off those muscles. For all the gold stitching on the coat, I used a Citadel layer Guiana's Gold, and that it gives it a gold color, but nothing too bright. And then I just hit it with a highlight of Citadel-based Retributor armor to get some of the highlights out of that. Again, with that Guiana's Gold, I went around and did all the gold stitching on the sleeves and on the jacket. Once that was done, I used Vallejo Model Color Deck Tan to paint the frilly lace sleeve things around his wrists. And I had to do 2 coats of that. After I did that, I used Citadel Contrast Apothecary White to spray into the shadows of that white. And then used a Vallejo Weathering Slimy Grime Light to dirty that up a bit and make it look a bit weathered. For his face, I used a Vallejo Model Air Yellow Ochre as a base color, and then did the shadows with a Japanese uniform from up underneath. I also used the same colors for his hand that wraps around the cane, and speckled some Reichland Flesh Shade on a low pressure to give it some visual appeal, and then did the highlights with a Vallejo Model Color Dark Sand. In the eye sockets, I used a Citadel Contrast Magos Purple. And then when it came to doing the sucker things on his face, I mixed Magos Purple with Volupus Pink, more purple than pink, and then watered down a little bit and just sort of covered that. For his headband, I used Vallejo Game Color Alien Purple. And then I dry brushed a little bit of Vallejo Game Color Lustful Purple over top of that headband just to give it a secondary color. In the home stretch now, I moved onto the cane and painted all the wood areas with Vallejo Model Color Mahogany Brown. And then much like the ship, I used Agrax Earthshade and sort of flooded that whole area where I painted the wood previously. And that gets into the grooves there and gives it a bit of contrast. After that, I used AK's Cork Color and dry brush that over all of the wooded areas to give it a highlight. And then I went back and used more of that Dirty Down Moss effect paint and speckled that all over the areas of the cane where it looked like moss or algae were growing. Moving on to the fingernails, just like bone, I started with a base coat of ivory and then covered that over with some of the skeleton horde contrast paint to give them a bit more realistic look. Once that was done, I moved on to the hat. I used a base color of anthracite gray, and for the highlight color I used somber gray, the Vallejo Game Color. And for underneath in the shadows, I just used a straight Vallejo Model Color black. And then for the rest of the hat, I'm just doing the same process for the muscles and the barnacles that we did on the other parts. As I put the finishing touches on this, I just want to say thanks for sticking with it to the end. I know it's a bit of a long video. I hope you enjoyed watching the process as much as I enjoyed making it. And if you did, please share it with others and consider subscribing to the channel and checking out my Instagram page. Hopefully you learned something, or maybe it inspired you to start your next project. I'm calling this one a wrap.